Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Berkeley Book Chats. I'm Stephen Best, the director of Berkeley's Townsend Center for the Humanities. Today, we're joined by Sophie Volpp, professor of of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Comparative Literature, and the chair of the Center for Chinese Studies. Sophie will discuss her recent book, The Substance of Fiction, Literary Objects in China, 1550 to 1775, with Professor Dory Hale, the Rachel Anderson Stageberg Chair in English. Before we begin today's conversation, I'd like to draw your attention to a few upcoming Townsend events. First, I'd like to announce the campus-wide residency of the South African artist William Kentridge. Over the course of the coming year, BAM PFA, Cal Performances, and the Townsend Center will be hosting a series of events with Kentridge. And the first event to happen on campus will take place on Friday, November 18th, when Kentridge will deliver a visual lecture entitled To What End?, in which he will consider the process of making the opera Waiting for the Sibyl, a work that will be presented by Cal Performances in March of next year, March 2023. To What End will take place in BAM PFA's Osher Theater. Tickets to that event are free to UC Berkeley students and are available online. Please go to the BAM PFA website or the Townsend Center website for more information on that event and on the residency more generally. Our next book chat will take place next Wednesday on November 9th, when we'll be joined by Elisa Tamarkin, a professor in the Department of English, to discuss her recent book, Apropos of Something, A History of Irrelevance and Relevance. Elisa will be joined by her colleague in English, Professor Sam Otter. So let's now join Sophie and Dory to hear their discussion of The Substance of Fiction.
I want to begin by thanking the Townsend Center. I'm so grateful for so many things, but most immediately for first introducing me to Sophie and to your book project, Sophie, through the Work in Progress faculty group that was sponsored by the Townsend Center and organized by Victoria Kahn and Eric Naiman. You shared then what was to become the final chapter of the book we're discussing today, The Substance of Fiction. I'm grateful to the Townsend Center for nurturing this kind of cross-conversation among humanities faculty, because in reading your chapter in progress, I came to realize that your book didn't just provide me with an understanding of a literary tradition far removed from my own area of expertise, for which I'm very grateful, but also excitingly engaged with conceptual issues and theoretical issues of common concern. Especially interesting to me in reading the completed book is the way specific works of fiction operate within a shared cultural tradition and work together to construct the qualities of literariness and the qualities of fictionality that then become the hallmark of a particular vernacular tradition. But more generally, before we plunge into the thesis claims, I just want to say first and foremost that I find the finished book, I think it will reward a wide range of readers. The thesis is so eloquently developed from chapter to chapter, each chapter faceting the large-scale claim in unexpected and intriguing ways. It's also a model of interdisciplinary scholarship, and to me, it's also a model of close reading. Your engagement with the representational texture of the text, the way you notice details that other readers might pass over because they're expecting to see something and don't take this on board. And then what you make with what you see is so exciting to me. And it's something that I can see teaching in my literary theory class to model that kind of interpretive attention and creativity. So I think anybody reading the book can appreciate that. It's also, may I say, beautifully written, enviably written in your high lucidity, with which you handle even the most complicated concepts, which I'm sure we'll be getting into today as well. One of the real thrills of reading the finished book was to see how you develop these larger issues chapter to chapter. Central to the study is the issue of referentiality as a mode of fictionality. Your focus is, of course, on Chinese vernacular fiction as it emerges in the late 16th century with the first domestic novel in the Chinese tradition, The Plum Garden, and culminates in that monumental mid-18th century work, The Story of the Stone. The vernacular as a literary mode distinguished itself from the high style and the formal conventions of classical tales. As is true for other cultural traditions, the turn away from a high style is also the turn to the real. And you're drawn to particular works that are the focus of your study because there is a critical tradition that values these vernacular texts for their robust description of material culture. And you point out that these vernacular works of fiction have been prized by these critics for their referentiality. They're understood as valuable because they illustrate the reality. More particularly, the works you focus on have been mined by historians for the way they reference particular objects, like the tray on the cover of your book. The realist effect of these literary texts has encouraged cultural historians and art historians to try to identify not just the type of object described in the stories, say a python robe, but in some cases to locate the exact object. The literary text is regarded as helping to illustrate the terms of use for certain material objects. Knowing the history of these objects thus has for historians of material culture become the defining feature of these literary works. The value of literature for them is the value of the text understood as a documentary value. So that's where you begin, and your exciting project is to add what I see as a dialectical move to this critical practice. You share the critical interest in how research into material culture can illuminate the role of objects in vernacular fiction. But based on your understanding of vernacular fiction as having its own complex protocols of narrative representation, based on your sense, in other words, that vernacular fiction should be understood as having literary value as well as referential value, you ask a new critical question. And this is sort of the large scale question that we'll want to talk around and through. You ask, what does understanding the essential literariness of vernacular fiction have to do with the practice of using fiction to establish examples of historical practice? It is best that you explain in your own words what you mean by this fascinating question and how it builds on the work of the cultural historians, but also, in my reading, flips the table on them in really wonderful ways. So I want to work up to a full understanding of that thesis claim. But let me just say, by way of introduction, for those who haven't had a chance yet to look at your book, let me quickly say there are 6 body chapters, and each one attends to a particular object that has been particularly important for cultural historians, and which also plays a central role in the story. The python robe, a shell, a jewel box, a telescope, a plate glass mirror, and the trompe d'oeil decorative art. And let me just also say, by way of introduction here, let me list some of the key claims, sort of sub-thesis claims that you're making in your analysis of the literariness of vernacular fiction. And I hope as our conversation unfolds, we might be able to touch upon these and develop them a little bit more. They would be the depiction of an object in vernacular fiction you show us is often elusive, confusing, inconsistent, and again, very powerfully, downright contradictory in many of the stories. This distinctively literary way of depicting objects, you also claim, engages the reader in an interpretive act that maximizes in a pedagogic way the, as you put it, productive possibilities of confusion. And then lastly, the way the literary text constitutes itself as a literary object by positioning itself as a world which the reader can only partially apprehend is part of the, sort of a meta dimension of thinking about literary objects in terms of vernacular fiction. So all of those qualities are categories are fascinating to me, and I hope we can get to them. But why don't we just begin after, with that introduction? Would you like to begin by saying something more about the interdisciplinary nature of your own method and the way your own research in material culture has informed your understanding of the literariness of the vernacular tradition?
Well, thank you, Dory, for that beautiful, beautiful encapsulation of what the book is about. Really appreciate it. I think your question sort of has two parts, and maybe I'll begin with the second part first. I'm thinking that actually my argument is very subtly in this cover image, which is of a tray produced in the Kangxi reign period, so end of 17th century, beginning of 18th century, that was on display at the Asian Art Museum. And I walked past the tray, and I was so lucky that it was displayed vertically instead of horizontally, because this is the back. So we would never see it if the tray were lying down. But it's a cute little play with an optical illusion, where as the viewer progresses past the tray, I don't know if you probably can't get you can kind of get it if I move the book, actually. As the viewer walks past the tray, different rows of these vase-like shapes pop out and recede. They protrude and then they recede. And it's effect that is achieved only with the alternation of color, actually. So I have this on the cover of my book because that's what the last chapter is all about. It's about how, if we think about the terms that are used for perspectivalism in the novel, The Story of the Stone, we see that it's dynamic, that it's about dynamic recession and protrusion. And then we can take that back, actually, and use that to interpret paintings from that period that have been seen as perspectival and understand new things about them. To answer the part of your question about interdisciplinarity, I would actually say that through the course of researching this book, I stopped believing that interdisciplinarity can reside in any one person. One of the things that I love about this book as an object is it's just like a palimpsest of all the conversations, all the collaborative thinking. I team taught with our art historian, Pat Berger, and that was probably the most exciting experience of my teaching life. The last two chapters are completely indebted to the work we did there. And that experience actually also gave me a set of students, right, who are now art historians whom I can stay in conversation with. But when I look at the book, it's just a palimpsest of all the fantastic conversations I had with art historians and historians, and also with my undergraduate research assistants who brought in all their varied experience, right? So I have worked with the undergraduate research apprentice program at Berkeley for a number of years. And I was just thinking the other day, actually 8 of the undergraduates that I have had in that program have gone on to graduate school in Chinese studies. But they all brought in something different to this little lab that we had. And there was one time where I was just wrecking my brain to try to understand these 17th century optical diagrams of how lenses work that were done by these Jesuits working in China in the early 17th century. And my URAP student was an optometry major. And I was like, I just can't get this. How can this be true and this also be true? And he said, well, the reason you can't understand the diagrams is because they're wrong. So it took an optometry major to tell me that. But in any event, I ended up believing in interdisciplinary conversation more than interdisciplinary research. And my goal was, in the end, actually to be able to speak to art historians and historians who are using my texts and say, well, actually, maybe this is one way of using this material, right? So to stay within my bailiwick, but to be familiar enough with what they have said and what they have thought to be able to say, well, actually, I would probably use this text a little bit differently.
Yeah, well, that's something we should definitely pick up on, but in terms of the takeaway of the book, but could maybe just go back a little bit more to say a little bit more about your engagement with the objects themselves. I mean, you give the tray as an example, and that's very vivid, but you also, in other chapters, talk about, like reconstructing perspective murals and things like that. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the thesis of the book, and again, if we think of that dialectical relationship that you have to the material culture, because I think it's really important for people who haven't read the book to understand you're not proposing literariness instead of material culture, right? I mean, it's this really lovely, complicated relationship where you went, you did this primary research into the objects themselves as well, and you were in their presence as well. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about what you learned, what the takeaway was for you about that, in a little bit more detail, and then how that more textured understanding of these material objects led to certain interpretations of the literature in your book.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right that it was sort of like a dialogic movement where I would never want to reprimand anybody for looking to the text I'm working with to try to find an example of how things were, right? I mean, that's just international. That is how we read vernacular fiction. And it is how historians and art historians tend to use my texts. So rather than say, these are literary characters, they're not real people, right? These are fictional objects, not real objects. I actually wanted to kind of geek out on the historicity, right? And to go as far as I could in sort of understanding the technology better in historical context. And in that, I was really inspired by both Bill Brown and Elaine Freegood's early work. But I was also just trying to understand the questions of my students, right? I wrote this book for my students because they would say, why is the mirror so different in chapter 17 than it is in chapter 41? And I'd be like, oh, I don't get that either. Or what does it mean when the pearl seller, right, in this very famous short story says your silver had better have enough crackle in it, right? So I would have to go look it up, and I discovered the pleasure, right, of understanding a little bit more about the technology by which some of these objects came to be. But it is a sort of dialogic argument in that I'm trying to go as far as I can with historicizing the objects. And I chose these objects because in every case there was a secondary literature, both a scholarly literature composed both by scholars of fiction and historians, art historians. So there was kind of an existing conversation that I could intervene in. But what I found is these objects were often thematized, right? So the mirror is seen as a mirror, right? But the particularity of the mirror in 18th century China is lost. The box is seen as a box, but again, the particularity of what is technologically possible with a box in 17th century China is lost. So I wanted to go as far as I could with that to think about how these objects are figures. But at the same time also, and this is really crucial, to show that these fictional objects are not depicted as stable, right? That referential illusion is made of the interaction or the tension between the assumption that these objects are depicted stably, and then the reader's misperception, the reader's discovery of their own misperception, their own misapprehension as they traverse the text and find out that the objects have not been depicted in a stable fashion.
And then your larger kind of, again, larger takeaway builds off of that. So, but before we get there, which is kind of the end of the story, you know, and the flourish of the last chapter, maybe we could again just go back a little bit more to give people a sense of, again, how you're doing close readings of these objects within the literary text. And I'm kind of torn here because, well, I want to go to the box and talk, because that's such a fabulous chapter, and I'd love to give you the opportunity to talk about that chapter and the argument you make there. But before we do, can I just say, because your point about seeing the objects and then how you bring that into your analysis of the literary works, one of the points that you make, I think it's in the second to the last chapter on the story of the stone, when you're talking about the use of plate glass. And not only that, in terms of the mirror, which is very important as in your analysis because it's double-sided, right? And you wouldn't have known that unless you had seen an example of that mirror, and therefore you can track its effects better and the descriptive, you know, gesture better in the novel itself. But there's the mirror, but then there's, I just have to say, one of the coolest moments for me is when you were talking about the plate glass window and its resonance within the cultural context that you're describing with the importation of plate glass and you know, who got to use it and in what settings it was used. And you make that point that it was valued for the spatial, for the perspectival shifts, right? Like this is what to me was a whole new way to think about a window, a plate glass window, that it was valued because used as a window, it could give a new sense of an expansive view that was outside of the self, that was more, you know, expansive and maybe even more objective, right? But then it referred as well to the experience of the self undergoing that vacillation or oscillation between looking perspectively from one's own physical position to this, you know, sudden expansiveness. So your point is that ultimately the plate glass window keeps us in suspension. And that's, again, a literary effect that then is attributed, you know, to the depiction of objects themselves within that story. So I don't know if I've gotten all the steps of that correctly, but I just want to say that I thought that was like a really fabulous moment for me, where your primary research in the history of plate glass bore incredible close reading fruit in terms of your account of that novel. I don't know if you want to comment on that before we go over to the box, or yeah.
You know, I'm so glad you bring that up, because that was probably the most difficult thing to figure out in the whole entire book. Emperor Qianlong, who reigned 1735 to 1796, wrote a poem on the plate glass mirror where he talks about his pleasure in the technology. It's a very prosy kind of poem, right? Where he's talking about the Tane and kind of displaying his interest in the technology. But then he talks about the way the mirror, the plate glass window becomes a mirror. So he goes from mirror to window as mirror, and plays with this sort of freedom from a singular subject position as he's looking into the mirror from both inside and outside as the sun is setting. The window, this is why it was difficult. The window becomes a mirror, right? But the poem is playing with the positionality of the speaker in a way that is very unusual. And the ultimate takeaway is that from in this mirror, this window that has become mirror, the emperor is able to see the birds soaring above with a bird's eye view right? So he is somehow freed from any kind of singular subject position, which is exactly what an emperor needs to govern. But that was a really, really, really difficult poem. I was actually invited to speak at a translation workshop at Cornell, and I brought the poem, and we just all workshopped it together. I would love to actually show some images of mirrors, so you can see what the Emperor Qianlong was sort of playing with and thinking about the window becoming a double-sided mirror. So let me share my screen really quickly. There we are. Okay, so we have some boxes here that I want to show you in a bit, but since we're talking about mirrors, I want to go to mirrors. So here is a plate glass mirror in a Chinese standing screen frame. And plate glass, plate glass at this time mostly originated from Europe, as scholars like Reina Callas have told us. The technology is Venetian. It was, Venetians who discovered that you could have these long cylinders of glass and cut them open and flatten them to make these long pieces of plate glass. Emperor Qianlong actually had in his glass workshops Jesuits from the Black Forest and France who were working on bringing this technology to China. There's kind of a rivalry for the global circulation in terms of the global circulation of glass, just as there is in ceramics. But the best glass is imported from Europe. And so we have this European glass in a Chinese frame. And that gives us something that is unique anywhere in the world, because the Chinese screen frame is inherently double-sided. It's freestanding and double-sided. So you could have a piece of glass this size in Venice or Paris, but it would probably be in a gilt frame and it would be hanging on a wall, right? So it's the double-sidedness of the mirror that's unique. Here is a mirror in the home of the 18th century scholar, Ji Yun. It's still standing in Beijing today. Here you see why the plate glass mirror had a double-sided frame, because it inherited that tradition from the bronze mirror, which was often set in double-sided table screens. Right? So once I was able to see these objects, and they're available to anybody who's able to go to the Palace Museum, because these mirrors are typically set on, the plate glass mirrors are set on either side of the throne as a reminder to the emperor to think about the mirror of history and to think about to think about his own self-cultivation, his own example. Once I realized that these mirrors were double-sided, I realized that there was something more going on than we had noticed in the previous writing on the plate glass mirror in The Story of the Stone, right? And that mirror is a signal object. So much writing has been done about it. It becomes a trick door. And this door here, actually in the Forbidden City, I don't know if you can see it, but there is a mirrored door leading into a passageway. This is in the northwest corner of the Forbidden City. This door has been seen as a potential historical analog for the mirror of The Story of the Stone. This mirror, which is set in a kind of shelf for curios, which is in the Yonghe Palace in Beijing, has also been posited as a potential historical analog. Here you can see the three mirrors together. So all of these mirrors have been posited as potential historical analogs, but scholars had been thinking about the mirror in kind of a thematized way, right? And because of that, they had seen it as a figure of the solipsism or narcissism of the protagonist. And what you realize when you see that the mirror is double-sided is that one side is reflects the figure before it, and the other side is empty, right? And in fact, the inherent sort of quote unquote emptiness of the figure in the mirror in the Chinese tradition is a figure for or a metaphor for the imbrication of self and no self from a Buddhist point of view. So rather than saying that the mirror is a figure for the solipsism or narcissism of the protagonist, it's actually a figure for a much deeper truth, right? Or it's a figure for the freedom from a singular subject position and for the imbrication of self and no self.
Thank you. Maybe while you have your screen up there, perhaps then we could move over to talking about the reading that you give of the jewel box story, because that obviously connected to all the things that you're saying, because the chapters develop so beautifully from sort of orchestrating this thematics through all of the literary texts. But in the jewel box story, I feel that in the jewel box story and in the telescope chapters, right, for both of those, you're particularly concerned with the way the personhood of characters is figured synecdotally and symbolically, both dimensions, in relationship to objects. And that intrigues me so much because, first of all, it's an interesting reversal of what we usually say. I think we usually say that fiction is concerned with the depiction of persons and objects perhaps get anthropomorphized. But in this case, with the jewel box story, you are particularly interested in how the personhood of the protagonist is figured through the jewel box as a space of mysterious potential, as you put it. And I'm wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about that in relationship to this beautiful object of the jewel box that you have here.
Yeah. So the jewel box story, Du Shinyang sinks the jewel box in anger, is actually the story in the Chinese tradition that makes possible a metaphorical relationship between a fictional character and a signal object. And that might seem really, counterintuitive in some way, that wasn't always the case, but this is the story that makes later associations like Lin Daiyu and her handkerchiefs possible, right? So I was interested in learning more about the technology of these boxes, and pretty much anybody who teaches that story is going to talk with their students about how the box is a figure for the courtesan herself, right? But then it becomes important to know more about the box and how it might have been constructed. And there are very few clues in the story itself, but we are told that the box has gold tracery. And so here you can see gold tracery. So one thing I learned was that gold tracery is only used on boxes that are made of lacquer. Okay, so here's a wooden box. You would not have gold tracery on a wooden box. So that tells us that the box is made of lacquer. Once we know that the box is made of lacquer, we know that it does not have hinges or hinged doors, as you see on this wooden box, but rather it has a lift-off front, as you see in the foreground of this photo. So here too, you can see these are two photos of the same box, right? And you can see the lift-off front to the side in the right. So all boxes had to have something to keep the drawers in place, because in those days, there were no guides for the drawers. That technology had not yet been invented. So a drawer is really a box inside another box, right? And in this story, actually, is the first time that we come across the modern word for drawer, qiuqi, but it's used as an adjective for pull out, so for pull out box, right? So you have 抽屉箱 or 抽屉匣, pull out box. That's what a drawer is. It's a pull out box. So you need something to hold them in place, right? And that's why you need either the doors with their lock, or you need this lift off front. And then you see when you have this liftoff front, what that does is it makes all four sides of the box essentially the same, right? Which really calls attention to the opacity of the box, its impenetrability, right? And the importance of just having space and more boxes inside, right? And what that allowed me to do was I realized that the previous scholars who had written about this story were equating the courtesan with the contents of the box, right? So they were saying the gems and jewels, the jade inside, those are a figure for the value of the courtesan. The jade is a figure for her steadfastness. But actually looking at the structure of the box allowed me to see how the structure of the box is actually a figure for the metaphorical mapping of courtesan and box, right? There's a way in which you open the box and more and more and more boxes come out, right? So it's very confusing, actually. She jumps to her death with a box, which people assume is the box in its totality, but it's actually not, right? It's one of the tiny little boxes inside. And so it's that way in which a metaphor is never about, as my colleague Hannah Kronfeld would say, it's never about solving for X, right? It's never about the equation of tenor and vehicle, but about sort of a kind of mismatch that is productive and that we keep reaching for the next drawer, right? The next drawer inside the box, the next little box inside the box, which is what happens in the story. It's about the inequation, actually, of tenor and vehicle that makes this such a sort of productive and enlivened association between the courtesan and the box.
And what I see in your, like tour de force reading of the box in this chapter is, again, alternative values get circulated from the way you're doing the close reading and the way you're taking into account the material properties of the object that you've viewed and seen. And so one of the things that you say so provocatively and wonderfully is how, other critics are looking for the jewel to, correlate with the value of the protagonist, but the story raises the possibility that the emptiness of each one of these boxes is the value, right? That there can be a positive value. You also tell that wonderful, kind of classic, story about the character who misvalues the empty box and returns the jewels and wants to keep the box, and everybody thinks that's funny. But then you point out that this story actually validates that by giving a philosophical weight to what it means to be an empty box. And the protagonist then is her personhood is enhanced by its potentiality, right? That's an example where the emptiness is not something to be appropriated or filled in, but remains the sign of her singularity. So there, you're installing positive value to this idea of the emptiness that you see multiply referenced in the material object. But then could I also just say, and maybe you might say a little bit more about this, when you do that close reading of the protagonist as she holds the jewel box and she plunges to her suicide in the water, not only, again, your very specific observation that she's only holding on to one of the boxes that was inside rather than the whole big jewel box, and then what you make of that. But you also then in that close reading emphasize another important value of this tradition in the way that it thinks about material objects, and that is the performative aspect of opening each one of the boxes, right, as part of the metaphoric value and the synecdotal value. So do you mind just, saying in your own words about that aspect? Because I do think it, for me, it vivified the, fabulous close readings that you were doing of the literary text.
Can you sort of just repeat what you said about the performative aspect of?
Well, just that, again, in my understanding, you were saying that other critics kind of had read, okay, she goes from pulling out the first box and there was, whatever, a precious object, say jade, then, a pearl, then a diamond. And most people had read it as the jewels signifying certain qualities of, that were measurable and articulatable about the protagonist. But I thought your point was that what they were missing, it was the act of pulling out the boxes, and that there was always another box and another box and another box. And that was the performance of potentiality rather than equivalence, right?
Yeah, that's a fantastic phrase, the performance of potentiality. And it actually gets back to the way personhood is constructed in this story, right? Because we are told what everybody is thinking, except for the courtesan herself, right? So her personhood is constructed out of opacity, right? And that's why the box has to speak for her, right? That's why the metaphor becomes so important, right? And as you're saying, there's this sort of performance in which each drawer, with jewels of increasing value is thrown into the water by the courtesan, right? And as she's throwing in the water, she's saying, I am like a box, right? But the word for box that she uses alludes to this story that you just mentioned, in which, some dimwit buys a box full of pearls or gems and then hands the gems back to the seller and says, I just wanted the box, right? So that was my tip off, right? That the word that she's using there clearly refers to the story. And in fact, it's a homonym for her own name, right? So the word for box there is du, and she's Du Shenyang. So that's our tip off, really, that the important thing about the box is the space of potentiality inside. Right. And that is enhanced by this fourth wall, right, that's created by the lacquer wall in its grooves.
Great, thank you. Maybe we should go back to, not screen sharing for the minute, and then I can get the chat. And at this point, there are other things that I would love to continue to ask you about the reader. Maybe we could go over to that for a minute. But in the meantime, I just also want to say, to our audience that please, if there are questions for Sophie, please put them in the chat, and then we can bring them into the discussion. So while we're waiting for that, so one of the big payoffs, as we said, is the larger thesis claim that you're making for this the way the depiction of objects is also a pedagogical performance directed at the reader. And you actually have, very specific account of the circuit of stages that the reader goes through as they encounter and the depiction of objects and have to contend with their ambiguity and contradictoriness. So would you want to just begin by saying a little bit more about that? Again, I know it's very complicated and thick in your book.
Well, we could talk about that by referring back to the images of mirrors that I just showed you, right? So the mirror in the story of the stone, the plate glass mirror, and not only plate glass mirror, but the bronze mirror, is a figure of misapprehension. And, there are historical reasons why that might be true, right? Until the plate glass mirror was imported from Europe, mirrors were bronze, and because they were bronze, they could oxidize, so they had to be kept covered, right? So now you have these plate glass mirrors in standing screens. For the first time, you have full-length mirrors that are uncovered, right? So you can understand why the characters of the story of the stone keep coming across a plate glass mirror, a full-length plate glass mirror, and not understanding that it's their own reflection, right, in the mirror, right? So there's this sort of thematization of misperception or misapprehension. But the reader also is taken by these various fictional objects on a tour of misapprehension or misperception, or, is the text plays games with our readerly misperception or misapprehension, in that I mentioned earlier that, my students and I were like, why is the mirror looking different in chapter 17 than it does in 41? Well, in chapter 17, we have, and chapter 17, 22, 56, we have the freestanding mirror, right? That I showed you, the double-sided freestanding mirror. Chapter 41, the mirror is it's let into a partition, as in the example of the Yonghegong that I showed you, the Yonghe Palace that I showed you in Beijing. So scholars had tried to identify historical analogs, both here and in China. This was a huge trend, actually, sort of in the early 2000s, to try to identify these historical analogs. But when they would come upon a, sort of a point of confusion like this, they would just say, well, it's impossible to solve this riddle. And so I was trying to figure out, well, why should this be true? Because I'm seeing this over and over again, that fictional objects are not depicted as self-same. And we can explain it away and say, these novels are really long. They're 100 to 120 chapters. So maybe the author just forgot that the robe was green 3 chapters ago and it's black now. Maybe we can explain this away by saying another text was interpolated. That is actually what I think happens with the telescope story. Maybe we can say there was a lost previous version. That's kind of our favorite go-to with the story of the stone. But if we just start thinking this is all we have, right? We just have the text in front of us, then we have to try to make sense of the fact that objects are not represented stably, that they're not represented as self-same.
So a couple of questions are coming up on the chat, but let me just add one follow-up of my own to that, and then I'll bring in the questions. So you say in your introduction that part of this circuit of, the pedagogic circuit that the reader's taken on is that first step, we assume reality, then we're bewildered, and then we figure out or offer a resolution through our imaginative supplementation. And then you say, we recognize the limits of readerly perception and paradoxically grant a sense of verisimilitude. But then, so I get all that, that's fascinating. But here's the part that I thought was so original that I hadn't thought of myself before as a possibility. You say, the reader plays with the illusion to, quote, reproduce the effect of seeing the hollows appear. This is when you're talking in the last chapter about the trompe l'oeil. And that touch becomes a way of deliberately manipulating the illusion of depth. So you're then extrapolating from that in the story world to what the reader does, playing with the illusion, touching it, as it were, over and over again. Could you just talk a little bit more about that, or either how you came to that idea or what the weight of that idea is for you?
Yeah, thanks. That came about through my work on trompe l'oeil panoramic painting in the Forbidden City, which again, Pat Berger introduced to me when we were team teaching together. So this trompe l'oeil painting is really interesting in that it depends on techniques of stage scenery, depiction of stage scenery, that were brought to Beijing from Bologna, right? And so that's kind of what I was doing when I was showing you this little optical illusion here. If we had time, I would screen share again and show you some, some of the paintings that actually shift as you walk past them. Recessions appear, right? And I was actually, in a minor way, slightly incensed by the depiction of 18th century Chinese viewers in the accounts of art historians and historians who talked about how 18th century people in Beijing must have been fooled by these illusions. So they supposedly, would put their hands to the painting right, to make sure it wasn't real. And I just was like, that's a trope. It's a trope, right? We can't think of these 18th century people in Beijing as being that rustic, but where it was coming from actually was the translation of the story of the stone, not even the text itself, the translation of the story of the stone, where David Hawkes, the translator, added some key phrases. There's a rustic, unlettered grandmother from the countryside, Liu Lao Lao, who approaches a painting of a young girl. David Hawkes adds the phrase, she was unused to the foreign mode of light and shadow painting. And then weirdly, he actually adds this moment where she touches the painting and then realizes it is not real. So he adds that trope of the touch, right? But in fact, she realizes it isn't real in the original before she touches. And so I was thinking, well, so what were people doing as they were approaching, receding, touching? And I realized it's like a button in the Lawrence Hall of Science, right? You press the button and the thing goes, right? So you walk forward and you can enjoy the fact that the recession is appearing, right? You walk backwards and it disappears. To me, that's what the touch is about. And who knows, right? But at least I think it's a slightly more dignified way to treat our subjects.
And then you extend that to the reader, right? That's what we're doing once we're sort of tuned into the way that these objects both go in and out of reference, right? That we treat them as stable, and then we see how the text complicates that, deconstruction, as it were. But then we imaginatively supplement, and it's that back and forth and third term that then is created. Is that a fair characterization?
I love your phrase, in and out of reference. That is so fantastic. That is exactly what it's about. So in those moments where the reader realizes they have misperceived, we realize that, okay, there's a whole world going on here that we don't have full access to, right? There are conversations taking place. We're only overhearing a slight part of them, right? So it is that unstable depiction of the fictional object that actually helps to produce the referential illusion.
Right. Excellent.
Just as in these trompe-l'oeil paintings, right?
That is, to me, such a thrilling thesis to be mounting it in the book as a whole. So thank you. Let me turn to the chat. We have a couple of questions. Let's see. Hi, Professor Volpp. Really interesting talk. Could you expand more on your perspective argument? I think the term used was perspectivalism is what I think I volunteered. The chat says perspectivalism, but that may be a word that I introduced, so I don't want to pin you with that. But would you like to respond to the question?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole arc of the book. So thank you for bringing that up. I have to say, at one point in the writing of this book, I arranged to chat with my friend Anna Harritzen, who is a historian of material culture, has written a lot on porcelain. And she said to me, in all seriousness, Sophie, why should historians care about fictional objects? I realized that, we have to care about archaeology and art history, but why should I care about your fictional objects? And I was really wounded by that. So the last chapter of the book is kind of a rejoinder. Mm-hmm. What I wanted to say there was actually, if we look to these fictional texts for an example of illustrative reference, if we think of them as showing us how things were, we're kind of just producing a feedback loop. But if we look to the fictional texts to better understand the channels of thought that were carved in 18th century readers, we can actually see something new in historical artifacts themselves. So in the last chapter, I was working on these trompe-l'oeil paintings, these panoramic paintings that used what Marco Musillo and I, in collaboration, the art historian Marco Musillo and I, identified as using Bolognese techniques of perspectivalism. People had thought that they were using monofocal perspectivalism from Rome, and Marco and I figured out that it was polyfocal perspectivalism with multiple vanishing points from Bologna, which might not seem that important, but that those multifocal, the multiple vanishing points are what gives you those, the anamorphosis, right? The appearance of recession as you walk past. So the way I got to it, Marco came at it differently and arrived at it differently because he's based in Italy. But the way I arrived at it actually was to look to the story of the stone for the way in which it spoke about perspectivalism in other chapters. The way it used the terms autu, which are the terms that are most conventionally used to speak of perspectivalism. And doing that, I realized that perspectivalism was dynamic, that it wasn't static, right? And that was what gave me the key, both to reading the earlier chapters and to reading the actual trompe-l'oeil paintings in the Forbidden City.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question from the chat. Let's see. When does a fictional object become literary? What is the difference? This is from Max Sala. Hi, Max. How does a reader know? Is this when bewilderment and verisimilitude become operative?
That is such a cool question. Let me think about it for a second. Right. So, I mean, in a way, we're saying, when does a fictional object become significant in some way, right? When does it become significant to this dynamic that we're talking about in terms of misperception, misapprehension? And I don't think that there is any particular guide. There are a lot of things that I've wanted to look at that haven't panned out, right? Like I wanted to write about mercury because mercury is such a cool substance. It kind of transubstantiates itself. But it was a truly insignificant detail every time I looked into it. Then, the metaphorical resonance just wasn't there, right? So in answer to your question, I would say a fictional object in my terms becomes literary when we can use it as a metaphor for thinking about experimentation with literary technique. And we haven't talked about sort of all the moments in the book where that happens, right? But the telescope, for example, had been seen by previous scholars as an instrument that would give you greater clarity of vision. Looking at the way 18th century people talked about the telescope, it actually restricts your vision, right? And then it makes possible within the telescope story itself, experiments with focalization, right? Which are picked up and then put down. Or the mirror, actually, we talked a little bit about the freedom from a single subject perspective. That becomes occasion for an experiment with something that looks a lot like free and direct discourse. It's not free and indirect discourse, but that's the best way I can explain it in 2 seconds, right? It sort of allows the narrator to experiment with allowing us to see, a literary technology that allows us to see into other minds, right? So that, thank you for the question. That is how I would define the literary object for myself.
And I'm so glad in answering that question, you were able to reference the telescope story, which for anybody interested in the representation of consciousness in vernacular fiction, I strongly recommend that you read Sophie's wonderful chapter on that story. Again, we're pressed for time, so I'll forego my desire to want to recap your thesis in that chapter and leave it as encouragement for those who will pick up your book and read it for themselves. So unfortunately, it's 1 o'clock already, but thank you so much, Sophie, and to everybody who joined us today, and to Stephen and the Townsend Center. It's really just been a pleasure.
Yes, many thanks to Stephen and the Townsend Center, and thanks so much to you, Doris. So much fun to do this together. And thank you for the fantastic questions.